This morning we're going to be talking about old light on worship. Just because something's old doesn't mean that it's bad. The word a cappella means without musical or without instrumental accompaniment. It is music that is not accompanied by, we would say, mechanical instruments of music or man-made instruments of music. And we make that distinction, adding the word mechanical or man-made for a reason. We're not just trying to add words to it. I think it's very significant when you think about this word a cappella. It doesn't just mean that there are no instruments of music added. If you go back and you look at the history of the word, it means in chapel style. Isn't that interesting? And there's even a reason for that, and we're going to talk more about that. Now, the trend in modern worship is not just toward instrumental music, and you might find it surprising for me to say that instrumental music, mechanical instruments of music, man-made instruments of music, you might find it surprising for me to say that's a recent trend. Well, not in my lifetime, no. But in the big scheme of things, it's really a recent trend. I'll demonstrate that here in just a moment. But now the trend has even gone farther. And there seems to be an emphasis on entertainment and on performance. And oftentimes folks think that the churches of Christ are very isolated, very odd for their position. Well, let me just say this. If it is the case that the churches of Christ are isolated or odd on this particular subject, the issue is not what does the community think. The issue is what does the Bible say. What is the truth on the issue? We never want to be odd for the sake of being odd, and we never want to go along for the sake of going along. We want to be a Bible-paced people. But I want to share a quote with you. I recently purchased a book that I thought I would be interested in. And I want to share a few things with you from that book that I purchased. I'll tell you more about that and about the author in just a moment. But let me share this quote with you. What is the source of this pressure? And he's talking about this trend toward entertainment and performance in worship and more instruments in worship. What is the source of this pressure on our generation to have musical instruments? It does not come from the New Testament Scripture, and it certainly does not come from church history. One is left to suspect that the real source of this pressure is from the world and from a modern church that has embraced so much of the world with little regard for God's rights in His worship. I think he's exactly on the money. This writer does not believe that any instruments of music should be used in worship. And somebody looks at that and says, well, you found a good Church of Christ preacher to write this, and of course he's going to believe that. And the reason why I point this out is because sometimes, people just say, well, of course you're going to say that. You're a Church of Christ preacher. I have a brother in the flesh that oftentimes when we disagree on Bible issues, he said, well, of course, Billy, you've always grown up that way, and that's what you've always believed. Well, that's not true. I've not always believed certain things, but that really doesn't matter. Either it's right or it's wrong. But I think this is rather interesting. This comes from a book, not from a Church of Christ preacher, but from a fellow who wrote this book back in 2005, and he, in fact, is the preacher for Grace Baptist Church in Rochester, New York. Now, that's not the norm for Baptist preachers. As a matter of fact, this book is causing a lot of excitement and a lot of rumbling. As I looked on the internet to read some of the reviews, it is an amazing thing that's happening as people are beginning to look at this book. Interesting, just a side note that I'll mention. It's kind of interesting that in the churches of Christ, oftentimes if we're not careful, we want to be like the other nations around us, right? We want to be like the other churches around us. And as is the case, oftentimes the denominations begin to figure out they've gone the wrong way, and the Church of Christ is still trying to run to be like them. What we need to do is let's just be like the Bible. Let's do what the Bible teaches on this particular subject. In this particular book, Old Light on New Worship, written by this Baptist preacher, and he came to the conclusion. He worshiped with a piano, and he came to the conclusion after he studied, he said, you know what? We shouldn't be using the piano. And he approached the church where he preaches, and they got rid of it. They worship without any instruments of music. Now, he goes through a very logical progression in his book. And this is a major point here that cannot be denied. The testimony of history is that the early church did not use man-made instruments of music in worship to God. This is a point that's beyond dispute. Now, I'm going to share several quotes with you this morning. This one is on your outline, but I think it's worth considering. This is what John Price, in his book, Old Light on New Worship, has to say, just in introduction to this. As we look back over the entire history of the church, the evidence rejecting the use of musical instruments in New Testament worship is overwhelming. For hundreds of years before the coming of Christ, the Jewish synagogues from which the apostolic church derived its worship knew nothing of musical instruments. Now pay close attention. For 1,300 years after the apostles, the vast majority of the church continued to deny their use. It was only during the dark ages of Roman Catholicism in the 14th and 15th century that we find the rise of musical instruments in the worship of the church. The church fathers, the reformers, the English and American Puritans, the Scottish, Irish, and American Presbyterians, and many of the most prominent theologians since have all declared that musical instruments have no part in Christian worship. Do you understand what he's saying? Now we'll look at, in just a moment, there were a few dots on the timeline before we get to the 1300s, but for the most part, there was no widespread use of instruments, and even then it wasn't very widespread until you get 1,300 years after the establishment of the church. I mean, what's going on relative to this? Now, when were the first church organs brought in? There's an account that around 670 was the earliest account that we have of an organ being introduced into a church, and this is a very isolated situation. Now think about this, folks. Even if they become widespread at 670, this is 600 plus years after the church was established. Why did the church... And again, we'll look at some more data here, and I have not given all of it to you this morning. But why would the church go so long without using instruments of music? Someone said, well, they didn't have the opportunity. No. Well, they had instruments in their day and time, just like you have a guitar at home. They'd have a lyre. They'd have their instruments that were available to them. No, something else was going on along this particular line. The early reformers and men who had an endeavor to go back to the Bible, they had a problem with instrumental music as well. Martin Luther, who was a reformer, left the Catholic Church. He had to say this: the organ in the worship is the insignia of Baal. In other words, it's just like idol worship. He did not believe that it had any place. Spurgeon, who is oftentimes referred to as the Prince of Preachers, especially among the Baptists. He preached from the later 1800s onward for the Metropolitan Tabernacle in London, England. He preached every week to 10,000 people. And they sang without the accompaniment of musical instruments. And he said, what a degradation to supplant the intelligent song of the whole congregation by the theatrical pettiness of a quartet, bellows, and pipes. We might as well pray by machinery as praise by it. He says, this has no place. This doesn't fit in. We don't need a quartet. We don't need a choir. Today we've updated it. It's a praise team. We don't need any of that. We just need singing. As you go back and you look at church history, Clement, Chrysostom, Augustine, Calvin, Knox, Martin Luther, Wesley, Spurgeon, and a host of other religious leaders all opposed man-made instruments of music in worship to God. As a matter of fact, Emil Newman, in his work, The History of Music, and his work was not specifically about church music, but he dealt with that within this work that he did. He said there can be no doubt that originally the music of the divine service, in other words, he's talking about the church, was everywhere entirely of a vocal nature. The early church did not use instruments of music, mechanical instruments or man-made instruments of music in worship. They just didn't do it. As a matter of fact, look at it from this perspective, it was about 670 when the first instrument was introduced, and it was in the apostate church, in the Roman Catholic Church. You have to go about 1,300 years before you begin to find several churches doing it. And then if you go even farther, it was not uncommon. I'll share a quote with you in just a moment. Presbyterians back in the 1800s, they stood opposed to the use of instrumental music in worship, man-made instruments of music in worship, for the same reasons that we do. There's no Bible authority for it. Well, that being the case, that we look back and realize the early church did not use mechanical instruments of music in worship or man-made instruments of music in worship, then we must ask the question, why? Why did they not use these instruments? And I want us to think about that for just a few minutes. Why did the early church reject man-made instruments of music? Again, the fact that they didn't is beyond controversy. But just that they didn't is not enough authority for us to say that we shouldn't. But they didn't. And why did they not do that? Well, let's consider a few things this morning. Number one, in the Bible, God commands that we use the instrument that He made. There is an instrument that is to be used in worship to God. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse number 19, that instrument is named. We're told that we are to be speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. The instrument that God expects us to use is our human heart. In other words, our whole intellect. We are to put ourselves in it. One of the things that we see in the New Testament is the emphasis on the inner man. Now, this Greek word solo, making melody, and it's closely akin to the Greek word psalmos, from which we get the word psalm. They have, in the early stages, they were used differently, and just like we have words that evolve, by the time we get to the New Testament era, solo was used exclusively of church music, which was a cappella. Now, in the origin of that word, it had to do with solo meant to pluck, to twitch, to twang, but you never knew what was under consideration unless whatever was the object was named. In other words, you could pluck a whisker, you could pluck a carpenter's string, or you could pluck a lyre. And so the instrument had to be named. Now, isn't it interesting that here in this text, the instrument's named. We're to make melody. The solo, what? The human heart. And so God has named the instrument that we are to use. I think that's interesting when we look at this quote from Clement. He lived around the latter part of the 2nd century. The Lord fashioned man a beautiful, breathing instrument after His own image, and assuredly He Himself is an all-harmonious instrument of God, melodious and holy, the wisdom that is above this world, the heavenly Word. See, this individual that lived in the latter part of the 2nd century, he said, we've got an instrument. God's given us an instrument, and we are to use it. Secondly, this morning, the early church, I would say, didn't use it because there is no authority in the New Testament for man-made instruments of music. I want to go back to a quote from John Price. This is an interview that he gave. He said, since my conversion to Christ, and this is the Baptist preacher who wrote that book, Old Light on New Worship. Since my conversion to Christ, I have worshiped for over 20 years in churches where the piano was the only musical instrument used. The stated reason for its use was always to aid singing, though I could not find any such practice in the New Testament. I accepted this explanation for some time. After doing my study on music in the church, I came to the conclusion that the use of musical instruments was not to be part of the New Testament worship. It was at that time that my church made the change to a cappella singing. Now, isn't that interesting? Now, I would love to have the opportunity to get to know this gentleman and perhaps have some studies with him. He's got the right idea. We have to have Bible authority. There is no Bible authority on it. I mentioned to you a few moments ago that the American Presbyterians, they agreed with us on this for years. Back in their publication, their Confessions of Faith, back in the 1800s, they had a question and answer section. The question, is there any authority for instrumental music in the worship of God under the present dispensation? Answer, not the least. Only singing of psalms and hymns and spiritual songs was appointed by the apostles. Not a syllable is said in the New Testament in favor of instrumental music, nor was it ever introduced into the church until after the 8th century. Isn't that amazing? This idea that there is no Bible authority for instrumental music in worship. Now, it is interesting when you look back at the Old Testament, they did have authority to use man-made instruments in worship to God. Back in 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 25, there they talk about those who were to be stationed in the temple and all the instruments that they were to use. And the verse then says, thus was the commandment of the Lord. As a matter of fact, that's just one verse. All you really have to do is look at the Psalms. Look at Psalm 150. Not all the Psalms, but Psalm 150 is one of them, where you can see that God most certainly did authorize the use of mechanical instruments of music in worship. And 2 Chronicles 29:25 makes this clear. God knows how to make it crystal clear what He commands and what He wants. In the Old Testament, He wanted mechanical instruments of music or man-made instruments of music used in temple worship. When we come over to the New Testament, we don't find that. Now, when we look in the Old Testament, we see that the Old Testament authorizes both singing. We had read for us just a moment ago, Brian read for us Psalm 96, and playing Psalm 150. But the New Testament has no authorization for man-made instruments to be used in worship. Now, right about now, someone says, well, Bill, give me the verse that says it's not authorized. Well, that's the point. There is no verse. And when something is specifically authorized, everything else is prohibited. Well, where did you come up with that principle, Bill? Well, let's look at it. It's used over in Hebrews chapter 7. There, the writer of the book of Hebrews is making the point there's been a change in the law. And how does he know that? Read with me. For the priesthood being changed of necessity, there is also a change of the law. For he of whom these things are spoken belongs to another tribe, from which no man has officiated at the altar. Now listen closely. For it is evident that our Lord arose from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood. What's the point? He never authorized. The law of Moses never authorized a priest to come from the tribe of Judah. Well, where's the verse that says thou shalt not have a priest from Judah? You don't need a verse that says thou shalt not have a priest come from the tribe of Judah, because it specifically authorizes priests to come from the tribe of Levi. Therefore, since you don't have any other authorization, that rules out everything else. We're commanded in the New Testament to sing. In the Old Testament, they could sing and they could play, and they were commanded to play. We don't have any such authorization in the New Testament. The New Testament specifically authorizes vocal singing. You go through in any situation in the New Testament that has even a nuance of worship, even the apostles walking along, you're going to find it is vocal singing if worship is under consideration. Another point that I think is worth our consideration is the fact that man-made instruments do not communicate objective thought. I love instrumental music. I do. I really do. And I love all types of music. There are several instrumental type songs that came out from the late 50s that I really, really like. No vocal, no words, and just instruments. And they make me feel good. And there's other types of music that I like, and perhaps you like as well. Classical music, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. I mean, it's very, very moving, but no words. Or jazz music, no words, just jazz type music. But what does it mean? Well, it makes me feel good, but what does it mean? Give me an objective meaning to the music. There is no objective meaning, but it makes me feel good. Well, that's great. But in worship to God, our singing is to have objective meaning. Over in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 19, what are we to do? Speak to one another. And so consequently we're communicating something. Over in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, there Paul talks about the problem you had in the early church, some people that were given the gift to speak in languages that they never studied. What a blessing. It's been a long time since I've been able to go down to Latin America, but oftentimes I always thought about this. Wouldn't it be wonderful when I went down to Latin America if God gave me the gift And those gifts have ceased, 1 Corinthians 13 teaches. But wouldn't it be wonderful to go someplace, to Russia or to Latin America or some other place, and just be able to speak their language and communicate the gospel to them clearly? But if I came back here and let's say God gave me the ability to speak in French or Spanish, and I got up here and I would be really impressed if I could just stand up here and preach the whole sermon in Spanish. And there's one or two of you that would benefit from it because you know Spanish and you're very good at Spanish or French or some other language. But for the most of you, it would just be an exercise in me showing off. It wouldn't be anything else. There'd be no benefit in it. And Paul makes the point in 1 Corinthians 14 that that's not beneficial. We need to sing with the understanding. We need to pray with the understanding. And there has to be real communication, objective thought that takes place in our worship. Furthermore, man-made instruments are inconsistent with the nature of the new covenant. John Calvin made this statement. I think he was right on the money. Musical instruments in celebrating the praises of God would be no more suitable than the burning of incense, the lighting of lamps, and the restoration of the other shadows of the law. Why do we want to go back to the old law? The old law was expressed in a very outward way. It was manifested, if you would, in a very mechanical way. The old law was spiritual, but yet God chose for some reason to give us this very outward expression of the law that is now, we understand, fulfilled in a very spiritual way. Think about some of these contrasts. In Exodus chapter 24, verse 12, we see that the law was written on tablets of stone, but in 2 Corinthians 3 and verse 3, it talks about the law is written in our hearts. Doesn't mean that it's written there miraculously, but it's a difference in the idea of the nature. In Exodus 30 and verse number 1 and 2, we see that incense is offered to God, but in Revelation 5 and verse 8, we see the idea that the prayers of the saints are incense to God. In 2 Corinthians 29 and verse 25, they were commanded to worship God with man-made instruments. Today, we are commanded to make melody in our heart. Chrysostom had this to say, David formerly sang songs, also today we sing hymns. He had a lyre with lifeless strings. The church has a lyre, or an instrument, in other words, with living strings. Our tongues are the strings of the lyre with a different tone indeed, but much more in accordance with piety. What's he saying? That was appropriate under the old law. That's no longer appropriate. That's not the way God wants us to worship Him. The modern trend in worship is toward entertainment. It is toward performance. But when we look at the New Testament, it is something very different. All of worship is designed for participants. There are no spectators in worship. Well, let me correct that. God is the spectator in worship. We are the participants. Last week we talked about the fact that worship is to be God-centered. The problem is we get things out of kilter sometimes and we think it's about us. One last quote from John Price from his book, Old Light on New Worship. He says, what God desires in His worship is hardly a consideration. He's talking about this modern trend in worship. What appeals to man and makes him feel comfortable in church is the theme of countless books on worship. The increasing use of musical instruments and the sensuality of modern worship is a manifestation of this man-centeredness. I think he's right on target. We want what we want. And let me tell you something. We'll have some more lessons, not necessarily about instrumental music, but about this, the necessity of worship being God-centered. It's not about us. It's not about whether I get something out of worship. It's whether I put something into worship. I am here to give. I am here to worship the one true God. And someone said, but I like instruments. What's the big deal, Bill? Why does it really even matter? Let me tell you why it matters. It matters because of the cross. It matters because of trust. Well, I don't get it, but will you trust God? Will you trust God? The early Christians, for some reason, they didn't use instruments. The Old Testament was authorized. In the New Testament, it is not authorized. Am I going to trust that God knows more than me? Am I going to exercise an obedient faith? Am I going to respect Bible authority? That's why it matters. Is my worship going to be God-centered? or is it going to be man-centered? Now let me tell you something. This is your last point, but I have on your outline, but I have something else to say. The nature of worship demands that we focus on God, not on our selfish desires. Now this lesson has broad applications. What it really comes down to is I have to make it the passion of my life. No matter how trivial I might think it is, I need to make it the passion of my life. What does God say? What does the Bible say? Is this practice scriptural? Why? Because God is so great, so wise, so powerful, so loving, so benevolent, and I am so dependent upon Him. Without Him, I am nothing. And He deserves my total, absolute devotion. Which of you, if you were convinced that God said to you, listen, I want you to stand on a table on one leg. I want you to stand on that table and just stay there for 5 minutes a day. How many of you, if you really believe that God told you to do that, how many of you would not do that? But God doesn't ask us to do things that are foolish. Well, we may look at them like they're foolish, but He has reasons. Are we going to trust Him? Are we going to trust Him that He knows what's best for us? Are we going to trust the fact that He knows how to communicate to us? And it may not be about instrumental music that you're struggling with. It may be some other area. But ultimately, all of us, we need to trust God enough that we'll divest ourselves of our own selfishness and our own desires and say, your way, Lord, not my way. And that's what the plan of salvation is all about. Because the whole process is saying, I'm giving up. I'm going to trust you, Lord. I believe everything that you have to say about your Son, and so much so that I'm not going to live my way. I'm going to repent of my way. I'm going to live your way. So much so that I'm going to own the name of Jesus. I don't care what the world has to say. I'm going to tell them I believe that He is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I'm going to give up. And I'm going to be immersed. The most submissive act. Don't you ever let anybody tell you that you're trying to earn your salvation being baptized. It's total submission. You're dying. You're going to be baptized for the forgiveness of sins, to be raised to walk in the newness of life. I'm giving up, Lord. I can't live this life on my own. All I can do is trust and obey, and so I'm going to live faithful. If you say it, Lord, I'm going to do my best to do it your way. You see, what it really comes down to is putting God at the center of everything. We invite you to come to Jesus while we stand and sing. This old church building could serve to illustrate the lives of many people. Once bright, full of life, full of hope, now falling apart, barely recognizable. There may not be any hope for this old church building, but there's hope for you. I'd like to introduce you to hope. And hope has a name, and that name is Jesus. Let us help. We're the Abingdon Church of Christ. We meet in the round building on Denison Drive at exit 14 in Abingdon, Virginia.